Good morning. Welcome to the MTT News of the Week. It's 8:48 a.m. on the 4th of February 2022 in Beijing. Morning, Jen.
Good morning. Good evening. It's the 3rd of
Evening for
February
you.
over here. Yeah.
3rd of February in the US still, yeah. So the headlines this week and some news from the communist parties. In Guinea-Bissau, a country in northwest Africa, there's been an attempted coup. The inflation rate in the Eurozone has just jumped to 5.1%. In Cuba, there is a new families code which is being discussed. The government has opened platforms for people to discuss and contribute to the new families code. Next week, we will be talking about the great supply chain disruption and what is going on with that right now in the world. Amnesty International has officially announced Israel as an apartheid state. It has been 1 year since the coup in Myanmar, military coup, and in other news, Trump has also been implicated in proposals during the 2020 election to seize voting machines. Downing Street in the UK, Boris Johnson has had 4 of his senior aides resign from number 10 from Downing Street. And obviously that's pushing into the idea of potentially a push for his resignation. Next week also we'll be discussing a book ban. So book bans in the US and what books they are banning, and we'll be talking about that too, but not today. Other news for this week though, the Italians have re-elected their president, who's 80 years old. And the last piece of news for this week is the Winter Olympics in Beijing will kick off today. And of course, there's been a torch relay across various parts of the country, passing the Olympic torch and getting ready for the games. So yeah, those are the headlines for this week. But this week we do have a special guest with us. We have got Vassal joining us, who we'll introduce in a moment. Particularly going to be talking about American politics, Ukraine, unionization, and whatnot. Do you have any thoughts before we jump into our main conversation, Jen?
Well, clearly a lot of it is tied. So the supply chain is definitely tied to the union question, because workers, literally makes the world work. And we've talked about on previous episodes about how COVID is antithetical to any kind of activity that requires large concentrations of people, right? So it's obviously from a worker's perspective has made workers' lives miserable, or just straight up ending them in some cases. And of course, on that front, I would also say that Biden, who is president of the United States, has made his speech recently, and basically number fidgeting, messing with the statistics to prove the greatness of his presidency and so on. That's typical, but what we saw was that he claimed that unemployment went down. But then, if you look at the total number of employed all workers in non-agricultural related production, the number hasn't actually gone up. So there's some very anti-worker, straight up conspiracies in that regard. And of course, with we've been covering on the second part, we've been covering Ukraine for ever since we started this programming. I mean,
yeah, right.
And the reason that it comes up in the news is all over, over and over again, really has to do with what our great guest Alessio has to talk about, which is how the kind of distortion lens of the Western propaganda, just how incredibly deep that goes, and how it is affecting everything, and even the things like the stock market. But essentially, like Wall Street, because they own all the media companies, can drive up false crises to the point where smaller investors, will look at the news and say, "Oh, World War III is about to happen, and let's sell all our stocks." But then, of course, those crises being false, the big investors, finance capital, buys in and destroys everyone else's profits. Big fish eats small fish, right?
Right, right,
So
right,
that's
right.
actually just what happened last week with the stock market.
Mhm,
So
mhm,
yeah, with that out of the way, I
yeah.
think yeah.
Yeah, sure, sure. I think my final thought on that before we bring in Vessel is on the
Mhm.
BBC BBC News there was another story of 5 Russian Bear bombers flying towards the north of Scotland. And if you've been watching the news for anything
Mm.
more than 5 years, you'll know that this is the annual story. This happens annually. There's
Yes.
the Russian bombers fly towards the north of Scotland. The RAF is scrambled, and it's just described as this panic and this Russian aggression. Um, yeah, so it's almost seasonal. But let's see what Vassal says. We're bringing in Vassal now.
Mhm.
1 second. Okay, welcome, Vassal. Welcome to the stream. Yeah,
Hello.
Thank you for
great,
having me.
great. So yeah, what are your thoughts on this, Vassal? So we've got. Is this a crisis, a false crisis, or is it a real crisis? This Ukraine situation with Russia and the US staring each other down, NATO staring down Russia, or vice versa. Is it a crisis or is it a manufactured crisis? What's going on in your opinion?
I think we need to look at how exactly consent is manufactured in the United States. That's, of course, a term from Noam Chomsky's book, but it has
Mm,
become widely used even in global circles. So it's not one manufacturing crisis process. So you look at America, most people they look at the propaganda and the CNN, the MSNBC, and all that, and it just starts with Russia bad. Russia wants Ukraine. They're going to invade Ukraine. We have to stop them. We're the good guys, and it doesn't
mhm,
get deeper into that. It wasn't always like that in America. Even in the height of the Cold War, they had like Castro on. They had like speakers from other countries on, and even in state media in other countries, of course, they have a bias but they have
mhm,
some speakers on from those other places. In Russia, they have Ukrainian speakers on daily. And here,
mhm,
there's no such thing. They're never going to have Zakharova on MSNBC Uncut. They're never going to have Lavrov or any of the big voices in Russia who talk about this to hear what they have to say. So we have to look at it from the perspective of Americans. If you want to know the truth about what's going on, where do you go?
mhm,
So the
mhm.
mainstream media is out, but that's not the only layer of propaganda in America. These parts of how consent is manufactured go so much deeper than that. So let's say you go next to social media, right?
Mhm.
And if you look on social media right now and type in what's really going on in Russia, like there's videos with like 3 million views, and it's all
Mhm.
just people giving the exact same story that you would hear there, but they have some sort of deeper meaning to it. Like, oh well, Russia, they feel bad that Ukraine left, and Russia was a great empire once. So they're coming to the same conclusion using a slightly different way, and they're portraying
Right.
Putin as somebody who's just like lost his girlfriend and wants to give her back at all costs.
But
And
so
these people are totally ignoring that it was Russia who helped dissolve the Soviet Union, and Russians do not want Ukraine back
mhm,
into their thing. It's been a very big hit for Russia just to have Crimea back,
mhm,
with all the social services and higher wages that they have to pay there to standardize everything back in Russia.
mm,
Um,
mm. Well, so I like this point you've raised here. Of it's actually on a conversational level between East to West. That right now it's actually worse than the Cold War. So in the Cold War, you would have a voice. Someone would come from the other side. Castro, you said, would speak, or someone would speak from the other side. Whereas you're saying now we don't even have that. So we're actually more, or the East and West divide is greater. Is more of a split. Is that what you're saying?
I think the danger of miscalculation is greater, but let me give you sort of the philosophy of it and how we got to here.
Mm.
The nature of control changed in America. So what had happened during the Cold War is you had the KGB and the CIA, and they would basically divulge different talking points to media outlets and expect them to publish them. So you had this sort of direct attitude toward control and how to get things done. And what eventually there was a phrase that came up during the Cold War, which is I don't need to, co-opt this guy. I can just co-opt his secretary. And if I control his secretary, I have all his files, I have everything that I need to know about him. Why would I
Mhm,
directly go to him when I can go after the media? So when you apply that principle, and this has sort of grown into a big thing in how information is disclosed.
mhm,
Between non-control and between control, there's something in the middle. It's all the things by virtue of which non-control becomes control. Okay, It's those medians, and those are the things that are now being corrupted. So you have this sort of like soft control and soft narrative that's pervade out there. So in the examples that I gave, okay, how do they control the media? Well, they no longer have to directly control them and tell them what to say because they control their income. You know, these people are now making $30 million, and you know how you keep that money, right? You don't have to publish what I tell you, but I'm going to tell you what the State Department says and what their sources say. You can do the rest for yourself. You know that if whatever you publish, if it goes against that narrative, you're not going to be on MSNBC any longer. When it comes to social media, how do you get 3 million views on a video about Ukraine? The algorithm is totally manipulated, right? Because the algorithm is the median, the means by which non-control becomes control of information. So let's say something else. Let's apply this to fact checkers. People, okay, I don't trust social media. I don't trust the mainstream media. Where else am I going to go now? I'm going to go to the fact checkers because I can look up if they're lying. I can directly see that they're lying to me by looking it up, right? Well, the median of that is what the claim is. And so what they've been doing and why everybody's pissed off at the fact checkers also is they're altering what claim people are making and then disputing that, or putting a portion of what somebody says and disputing that. And literally, the best example for me is like, for example, when they talk about Russian intentions against NATO, they make it sound like Putin came in and just started demanding that NATO would never expand and all that. And of course, the Russian side of it is always that, well, we signed an agreement with NATO that, or there was an agreement with NATO that they wouldn't expand eastward. So what the fact checkers say is, did Russia sign an agreement that they wouldn't expand eastward? And the answer to that is no, there's no such agreement, right? But that's not what the claim is. The claim is that there was an agreement. In international law, you can agree to things in many different ways.
Yes.
You see how they manipulate you. The German chancellor said, if there's unification in Germany, they will not become part of NATO and NATO will not expand. They said that point blank. So those type of agreements, verbal agreements, are very common in international law. Of course, they don't tell you that because then that discounts the whole Russia's just lying, Russia bad again. So you go to the fact checkers, you're going to get the same thing.
Sure.
So context.
So then you go to the academy and you think, well, okay, here is where we can question everything. Nothing is off limits. And there we can find the truth. That's where many people go, including me, have gone there. And what you find out in the academy is there's also medians there that are very restricted and very controlled, namely the data and the definitions and what's expected of you, right? So it's not you're going to go there and you're going to teach a class and you're going to wake people up and have them see the truth by preaching the truth. In order for you to keep your job, you need to write papers. It's all about output now, right? The nature of education has totally changed. How many papers can you write? Well, to write those papers, you need to use data that's accepted in these journals. And you need to use the definitions that they use in these journals. And you need to write about the things that they write about in these journals. So you can't make whatever you want to do. You cannot tell the truth about what's going on the ground in any of these mediums that we have.
Yeah, right. I'd like to just further add to Vasily's point. So essentially, two kinds of things. One with the writing paper and output being the center focus thing that Vasily was talking about. There has been this. So another part that contributes to that is the kind of religious worship of neoliberal, like Milford Friedman, capitalist absolutism. Kind of idea that only the corporation and the market is the most efficient thing. Therefore, all organizations, including academic ones, should be ran like a corporation. That's something you'll hear tossed around a lot. And so, of course, then how do you measure that? Well, you measure it by pure output and profit, right? So that's the first reason. And the second would, of course, be the liberal conception, and this ties back to American pragmatism philosophy and neo-pragmatism, where everything is just where they believe, basically. Long story short, and I'm sure I'm oversimplifying some things here, but basically they believe that everything is just the association of words and language. And of course, it came from a more complex background of Wittgenstein talking about language, the language game, and all that. But they now believe that research and science. Okay, so since every time when scientific innovations were being made, the language, the words used to describe them changed, right? So therefore, they believe, and this is like completely throwing out causation and correlation. This is just completely brain dead. That they start believing that changing words means that you can discover scientific innovations more quickly, and therefore you should just get all your entire institutions to like be set up in a way where constantly tossing words, scrambling words, changing words, mixing various definitions, associating different languages and definitions and concepts is all they're going to do. And these two together creates an extremely just toxic thing that Vasil was talking about. And it's basically become a self-referential cycle that never stops in its wrongness, so to speak.
Right. So what I'm getting at is that you have the academies are also a part of this phenomenon where distortions of what's actually going on in Ukraine and Russia particularly are happening. So the fact checkers are pinning specific conversations to, I guess, a particular thing. As you said, Russia signed an agreement. No, that's false. But there were agreements. And then, as Jin is saying there, that
in the academies, they just don't address this.
Yeah.
In the academies, they won't address it. The only thing that they'll address is that you have a dichotomy of liberal democracies and authoritarian countries, and on the one side, Russia and China, and the other side, America. Or sometimes you have a trichotomy where it's like partial democracies in the middle and to make it more comprehensive models or whatever. And you have to talk about things in those terms in order to publish papers. So if you go to the academy, you just simply won't address these things. But if you go to the fact checkers, they're going to address them in a way that they do. They're going to corrupt the medians as well and give you the false information that way. Now, let me just say, because people are accuse me all the time here in America, it's a favorite thing to do that I'm a Russian spy or whatever if you say anything to the country in a narrative. Russia's playing the same game. They're not as brute force or aggressive as the United States, but they have the same double standards toward international law that we do. They didn't accept Kosovo's right to independence, but they like Crimea's right to independence. Now, the United States, on the other hand, they like Kosovo's right to independence through self-determination. They don't like Crimea's right to self-determination, the same thing. So they're both hypocrites in one way or another because they're never going to have a consistent position because they're big countries with regional interests that get in the way of their morality. And so this game that they play has been a game of checkers for a long time going back and forth. Putin was sort of at his low point after Libya. And if you didn't see what happened in Libya, it is just ridiculous. It's even more ridiculous than what I just said with the agreement that they had that NATO wouldn't expand eastward, and they did it like almost immediately. And Gorbachev looked like a fool. Putin looked like a fool in Libya. And the way he did is because he signed an agreement with the U.S. They're going to make a no-fly zone. Okay, what does the U.S. do? First thing they do, send the ships, go bomb the country. And Putin said, wait a minute, what is that a no-fly zone? You're flying all over the place and bombing everything. But it was too late. The U.S. was already there. NATO was already there. And Putin was too late to stop it, unlike in Syria where they showed up in time, or else they would have gotten bombed also. So Putin's approval plummeted at that point. And when the crisis in Ukraine happened again and the democratically elected leader was overthrown, Poroshenko, by the U.S. and his cronies. Things would have been really, really bad for Putin if nothing happened in response. Getting dunked on like that twice in a row is not going to happen from his perspective.
So that's what I want to bring in there, Marcel, is the domestic consumption. So I think that's where you're going towards with this, is that there is this angle, yes, approval ratings and how you look in the world and standing and all of that kind of stuff. But specifically for domestic consumption, Putin obviously has, as you said, there's a requirement for him to do this. And also, I want to hear though, what about Biden too? What about his requirement? Why is he doing this? And I assume maybe you can disagree with me on this. Is Build Back Better has failed. Other sort of motions have failed in the US. You have an inflation rate. You have a very low approval rate. The midterms are not looking good. So what does this look like for domestic consumption? But you can go back to Putin if you want to explain that too. Go ahead.
For Biden, you could make the case that there's nothing to go on except he has to do some rah-rah stuff outside of the country. But really, the American public opinion, when you analyze it, the first thing you look at is how salient is it, or how do people know what's going on. And what happens in all those issues a lot of times when voters are in the right, such as healthcare and all that, the progressives tend to make the mistake that, oh, well, this means that the voters agree with us. Why aren't the politicians listening to them? But if you look at the salience of those things, if you just frame it a little differently, the public gets very easily manipulated into thinking the opposite of what they wanted. So, for example, you ask them about specific provisions in Build Back Better, they have one response, and they're generally very favorable. But you ask them, well, hasn't the government spent too much already? Then they go the opposite way. So, public opinion polls in America are, if you're going to take something seriously, I wouldn't advise a candidate to take that seriously compared to so many other things. So, Biden's agenda is different. Even before he was planning on doing stuff with Russia, they had a big summit of so-called democracies that excluded China in this and had authoritarian states that kill their own people in there. He has internalized this academic narrative, which he's a product of the academy, and so is Barack Obama, that there you do have this conflict. The major conflict in the world is not what we're at home think of it is. It's not what the voters think it is. It's this liberal democracy versus authoritarianism, and that he's going to be the defender of democracy, and that's his big thing as president. Bringing all these countries together that are classified as such, according to academic terms here, as being the democracies, the good guys against the bad guys. But how it's going to play out, like I said, it's a game of chess between these two big superpowers that sometimes one goes ahead and sometimes the other goes ahead. I wouldn't focus on it so much of that other than the angle of, how are medians controlled and what can we do to change them. That's our biggest problem right here in America. I don't think there's going to be a conflict in Russia. It's that if we can't trust our fact checkers, and you can't trust the mainstream media, and you can't trust the social media now because the medians are corrupted there, the algorithm is the median, and you can't trust the academies, well, where do you go for information? And so people are just believing whatever's popped in their head already. That is more damaging than what is going on in the Ukrainian border, because it does in effect increase the chances of miscalculation when you have so much misinformation, so many people saying the same thing and purporting this divide among people and states in such a way that is totally erroneous. They refuse, for example, in academies, they refuse to even label what an oligarchy is. Since Plato, we've talked about what an oligarchy is as a state. They won't even label it. It's all liberal democracy, authoritarianism. Right. Because if you do any measure of oligarchy, only rich people are in control of everything in the United States. There's one worker in Congress, right? And she couldn't afford to live there. She had to borrow money to go live there. AOC, of course. So it's to the point where, they don't even expect working class people to get elected. They won't even be able to afford to live there.
I'd like to add on to that. Essentially, this right here, what Vasco has demonstrated to all of us today, is the power of conception and narrative. Okay, so narrative is basically trying to display a conception, right? And then the power that conception has then on the rest of society. Even presidents can internalize that. So, of course, a class interest is involved, but at the same time, I'm a bit a little bit, at least, surprised because, like, I can understand why Obama bought into the narrative because he was also in the academy, studying, had some sort of degree in U.S. history, right? Did like an audio book for like one of the American political science books, I believe. So on and so forth. So like, it makes sense that he would buy into it. Trump is a living meme, and of course, his own thing. But for Biden to buy into that is actually a pretty good indicator, I would say, that the power of narrative and conception can really have. And so stemming out of that, then, so here in the Marxist think tank, we throw around this term that we call the mutually reciprocating echo chamber. It's just a term that we use. It's where the delusions of one side in an environment with multiple sides, right? The delusions of one side makes the other side, instead of with good information and trying to arrive to a sensible neutral truth, which is what we're supposed to at least do as human beings, as civilized people. Instead, they just use the delusion and fear mongering as a reason to entrench themselves deeper into their own delusions. And then that feeds back to the first group to do the same exact
Do you want me to
thing.
tell you why?
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
Go ahead, Russell, yeah.
Okay, so I wasn't going to let you go talking about pragmatism because for this exact reason. So pragmatism rejected what I study, which is essentialism. And when you do that, that means that what you're saying is there's no essence in any object. So we don't say somebody is a man, or somebody is a woman, or somebody is anything.
Oh no, we're going to get
good,
canceled.
somebody is bad by any virtue of what good or bad actually is, or what those things actually mean.
Yeah.
The way we judge things, and what pragmatism did, is to sort of a twofold thing, a different way of looking at objects. Number one is you look at each thing that happens to you through the consequences of it, through how you can interact with it, and the consequences that befall that. So it's given up on meaning of what something is. It's all a form of individualism. So John Dewey was against rugged individualism, so he's another form of individualist, essentially. A form of individualism, it's all about how you interact with the world, what decisions and individual choices you make. And the difference between that and the old individualism is we're going to give you resources, we're going to give you education, we're going to give you all those things that were deprived of lower classes in the past so you can make better decisions. So that has been so ingrained into America that it's in every single conversation. Philosophy is like, Nietzsche described as vapor. You don't see it, but it's all around you.
Yeah.
And Americans are totally ingrained in pragmatism, whether they know it or not. So how do they talk about socialism? You're going to starve to death. That's as deep as the conversation goes, is you're going to starve. Because you're talking about, you're defining something through its consequences. You're not giving me a definition of socialism. You're just telling me what is going to happen to me according to you under socialism. The only way you can have that kind of mindset and mentality is if you've internalized pragmatism. And so their whole idea was, we can't agree on meaning, so we're going to agree on consequences and make the process scientific. It's done the exact opposite. Okay? Because there's no agreement on consequences either, any more than there is on meaning. In fact, there's less agreement. Right? So they didn't see that coming. And so now you just have everybody lying about what the consequences of something is going to be. And that's the propaganda has taken that fold. And yes, as you said,
I'm going to jump in with something. Just obviously, let's throw in the devil's advocate in the situations, because obviously we're rallying against the academy here, right? The academies in general, and we use the term manufacturing consent. So they have this particular role. The academy, as you say, Vassal, setting the terms of the debate.
Each station manufactures an individual part of the consent.
So what about individuals like this, though? So we have things like we have guys like Zizek, Chomsky, Wolf, David Harvey, all of them in some ways very much in the academy, and others maybe more sort of in the periphery of the academy, so to speak. But a lot of these guys, and even Chomsky himself, the one who comes up with the term manufacturing consent, is a part of the academy. It's MIT, if I'm not mistaken. What do we say to that though? Because they are giving us the words we're using right now, at least on that specific thing of manufacturing consent. How much? Where do they put? Where's their role in that then?
Well, number one, they're far from mainstream, and number two, for every one of those that you see that break through in such a way that they become famous like that, you don't see how many people have been weeded out in these academies because of a simple thing that they weren't able to produce enough research output, and that's the only thing that they grade you on. You know, Richard Wolff has written books that are so influential that he doesn't need to write like 3 papers a year. You know, but if you're a younger academic or a new academic and you don't have the same exposure and you get hired somewhere, you got to produce a lot of papers very fast. And it's going to be difficult for you to remain in your position in that way. And that's just one way that they get weeded out. Noam Chomsky talks about this too. They get weeded out all the time. That's one of his main talks that he has all over YouTube. So
I'd like to
1 or 2 or 3 that are above the fray, or so to speak, have become so big that they're not. You can't get rid of them now.
I see.
Doesn't negate the fact of how these academies function as part of a system of manufacturing consent.
And to just give evidence to that, I've had like people, multiple friends and comrades who studied English major in university in the various different forms of writing. One of the things that I notice when we sit in a room and try to write something out for our own political organization and whatnot is they are trained to, like, let me put it in civilized terms, pump out a bunch of words like very, very quickly at extremely fast speed. That is like a word scramble that does not have a unifying conception behind it. But, like, isn't the whole point of writing, like, to communicate a conception for, like, a specific situation where it's, useful? And, of course, the greatest situation was just all of human knowledge and what the academy is supposed to be, right? But then, like, what on earth is, like, this form of training of just, like, pumping out senseless paragraphs like almost like an AI being, like, with human neurons, essentially. Okay, that's all I have to say.
Fine. I mean,
as they've made it profit-based, it is solely about research output. So in economics, it's not really about how much you understand these concepts or even how much you can teach them, right? The teaching can only get you fired if your students write bad reviews. They're not going to get you any big reward if you're a good teacher. It's all about your research output. It's not about your involvement in your community. Are you trying to help people or not? That's not part of it either.
Yeah.
And at the same time, as these universities are privatized, not even part of what contributes to their culture, why they're like this, those papers aren't even publicly available. You know, like, look how much money it costs to download like 6 articles in JSTOR. It's like hundreds of dollars to access these things.
Yeah.
So somebody wrote a code. I forgot the kid's name, but he wrote a code that made public the scholarly articles that were on these scholarly sites that are now secret, and you have to be a student or professor to get access to them. And he just made them all public. And of course, what did he do? The government went after him, and he committed suicide. And his dad blamed the government for his death, which is it's totally on their hands.
Right.
So knowledge is sort of bottlenecked in the academies, and the biggest point is it's fundamentally conservative, because when you deal with data, and that's your whole basis is econometrics and data, you're dealing with first of all stuff from the institutions that be, and how to make them better. You no matter how many Marxists or progressives there are in the academies, the function is fundamentally conservative. The only thing that your paper can do is either A, not get cited by anyone, which is what happens to almost all papers. Nobody reads them. Not even your mom will read them. Or if it somehow manages to help existing institutions preserve themselves, then somebody will pick it up within those institutions and apply it. But your progressive ideals and whatever you want to happen in terms of social change of institutions is totally non-existent.
To add to that, from a Chinese perspective, essentially, like when we observe what we observe about specifically Western think tanks, is that they have essentially just become two of megaphones, like white glove megaphones for specific interest groups to pass on their self-interested viewpoints to the society, and then retroactively having the think tank analysts to go out and find evidence and find sources for a preconceived kind of narrative that a capitalist group of a high group of groups of interest wants to find. So instead of going out into the world and finding what is going on and then putting that into a report to actually help a functioning government for working class families and and working people, instead the process is hello.
It's a dark mid-interview here in Vegas.
And the process has been completely reversed. I mean, it's instead what it becomes is a special groups of interest that are completely detached from working people, feeds these think tanks a preconceived notion that they want to be public, and then these little, basically slaves, go fetch sources in the world of information, like that one servant in the elf thing in the Harry Potter movies, Dobby, I believe. Go fetch bread or whatever for their masters. In this case, would be sources to then compile into a report, and then the groups that's funding these think tanks would then say like, "Oh, we had nothing to do with this. This was just independent third-party research."
Right. I think we've given a good beating to the academies. So let's move on to U.S. politics, internal politics, particularly in relation to the unionization that's going on right now. So we've covered the Starbucks unionization, which has been taking place very small scale, individual Starbucks, one in Buffalo and a few others now, probably about 5 across the country. The first Starbucks to be unionized since the 1980s.
5 individual shops, that is.
Individual shops, right.
How small that is.
Vassal, you wanted to talk about this and throw your hat into it, about unionization in America. So how is it going more broadly, looking beyond just Starbucks? How is it looking from your perspective?
So the biggest events here, in my opinion, were the Kellogg strikes, right? And the reason why that was significant is because in the offshoot of those strikes, you had activists rallying to help the workers. And previously, there has been a separation between labor and activists here in the U.S. One was in social movements, the other one's in labor. Now, basically, the activists flooded the company's sort of employment applications so that they couldn't replace the workers they needed to bust the strike. So, and you have more wildcat strikes. You've had the John Deere union strikes. So had like 10,000 people, right? And they were class conscious enough, or at least conscious of their own material interests of another class, to reject the first offer for management by a majority of like 90%. So people have come to myself and others say, why isn't this a big reason for optimism? And on top of that, on top of these higher strikes, there's unfounded support for unions that is unfounded as in sense and hasn't been around before. It's something like close to 70% around there, which is was 60% like three years ago, and it's getting higher and higher.
Again, 70% for what?
60. It's like 68% people favor unions now in America.
Okay.
And so based on that, people have come to myself and asked me, isn't there room for optimism of the unionization rate growing? And my answer to that has been no. I don't think the unionization rate is going to get much higher than it is now. Yes, you have the Starbucks store has unionized, but I think overall it's actually down by 0.1% or something since last year, and we don't know what it's going to be in 2022. But in order to move on past the unions and to see why they're not going to make a comeback, let me give a rundown of what exactly the unions were, how they came to be, and how they got totally defeated and demolished by the capitalists.
Mhm.
So the idea of a union preceded what we call unions now. And essentially, you had mechanization, and then the first industrial um, revolution. You had these mechanical jobs that anybody could do, including children, and you had an abundance of labor flooding into the cities to take them. You didn't really have to care for workers. You could just pay them until they broke their hand and then just, let them fend for themselves and starve.
Mhm.
And so they created sort of these little unions called Gilbert's unions that were supposed to provide health benefits for people to keep working once they stopped working. Those were
Mhm.
totally unsatisfactory to people, naturally. So the production union as we know it was supposed to be not just an alternative to the unions before them, but it was supposed to be a systematic alternative to the arrangement between worker and boss in the first place. It was supposed to offer freedom of organization, first of all, because you could go in, take the megaphone, unionize your workers, go into the boss's office, tell them what your demands are, do it like that. And there was sort of an idea also that you could threaten um, capitalism in general through those social support nets and linking it to revolutionary organizations. A lot of
Mhm.
these unions were linked to radical parties back in the day.
Mhm.
Even when the New Deal era happened, at the height of their power, they threatened FDR with a socialist revolution. This is
Yeah.
part of how he was able to get the New Deal passed, right? So the capitalists had to reconsider at that point what they were doing, because they were using brute force, they were using intimidation, airstrikes, even at some point, private military,
Mhm.
staging sabotage, provocations, and it was backfiring on them. Support for them was all-time high, and unionization rates were growing.
Mhm.
So they took a number of actions that I wrote a paper on. I summarized them down to 7 things that they did, and how they defeated them, and why we can't sort of see them coming back again. Number one, they established a bureaucracy. So this top-down structure of organization that wasn't supposed to be there. It's the union today itself mimics a corporate structure, right? So you have a board of directors, and the workers are down below, and the board of directors operates more or less in different locations a lot of the time. A lot of unionists are themselves involved in Washington and so on, uh, lobbying for these for their interests, but within the system. So they're separated. And then the union, because of that, could no longer promise to overthrow capitalism. It was no longer about founding a different type of social organization in workplaces.
Mhm.
So on top of that, they started taking these other structural reforms of the union, right? They got rid of the general strike. That's significant because your general strike was your biggest bargaining chip. I can shut down the
Right.
means of production. And it doesn't take that many workers to agree to it to shut down the means of production. But if you do a strike outside of the means of production, then you can have a few of the scabs show up to work, and then they can replace the rest of you to have the minimum amount needed to keep the place going, and then you're left out to dry,
Mm.
right?
That's are there, sorry, there are more points? I just want to hear all of them before I jump in.
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
And then what they did is they made it so that you can essentially have your cake and do it for free instead of paying for it. So as a unionized worker, you now have the choice to exit the union in terms of fees, but you get the same benefits as everybody else.
Yes.
And that has decapitated unions to a great degree too, because they don't have to represent their members. They have to represent all the workers within the place where they're unionized, regardless of whether or not these people actually pay for the unionization or not. So you can just leave and get the same benefits without doing anything.
Yeah. You don't have to pay for it. Yeah.
No. And then on top of that, you have clauses like this. There's 2 that are very significant. One of them is any group of workers can unionize. And that sounds fantastic. It sounds like something union activists would want, but it's not. Because what that does is it makes it so that any group of people means basically this lowest minority of people can unionize, but not the largest majority of people. It's not explicitly stated there, but they cannot unionize. So these corporations have become transnational and so large, and they're in every country. The most you can unionize through one unionization is one store. So, like in the
But
Starbucks,
why would a larger group not be able to unionize? So if a small Starbucks can unionize, why can't 50 or 100 or 1,000 Starbucks unionize
the
if they?
largest Starbucks can unionize too, but it would still be one store.
Okay,
It
but
wouldn't.
why
You couldn't unionize all the Starbucks in a state or all the Starbucks in a country. You can't have one big vote for that. Every single vote has to be for that group of people that sponsored the vote, and it's like I think you need like a handful of people to bring the vote in that
Right.
specific little department.
Yeah.
So that really decapitates union workers because you have some stores that are unionized and some that are not, most that are not, but not the whole corporation itself isn't unionized. Even when you actually go through the trouble and you actually win the vote. Okay. So you have to represent everybody, which is how they made it so you can have your cake and have it for free. And then you still have the intimidation and all those things. So really you have to look at it from this perspective. If you had a brother, let's say, and they were working, and you know that they're not like, okay, you guys, I know you know me, we're very stable, blunt, upfront, don't care, we can take anything. But if you have somebody that, how are they going to go through all this trouble, all the intimidation, all the threats that they receive at work, and on top of that, what are they going to get out of it? They're going to get a $6 raise, usually some higher health benefits. That's what the unions said they're offering. They're not offering a new system.
Right.
They're not even offering the social organization type that you like. So they've made it totally irrational to be the guy who takes all the risk to start this thing for everybody.
Right. So just on this then, how are these mechanisms held in place? So I assume that there's legislation passed at the congressional level, which is how these things are held in place. So the general strike being banned essentially as a weapon of the union, that I assume is legislation that is held at the congressional level. Am I correct in saying that?
Yeah.
Okay. And
the union cannot even talk about it. Like if the workers are organizing as in general strike, the union can get in trouble legally if they even mention it.
Right. Okay. I see. And then the other piece, the fact that if there is a union at a workplace, that all of the workers will receive the benefits of whatever concessions they win. That is also legislation held at the congressional level.
Taft-Hartley.
Yeah, that's from the 1930s, right? If I'm not mistaken.
I think it was past the 1930s, maybe 1950s or so, 19 or late 1940s or 1950s.
So I guess in your view, then, despite all of the sort of stuff we've seen, primarily because of COVID, so frontline workers being seen as essential, this thing about I forgot the expression that they use, but people deciding that they don't want to work low-end jobs, and sort of now the sort of a worker shortage or entry-level worker shortage in the US, and then seeing the Kellogg strike as well as the Starbucks thing. Despite all of these potential forces and pressures that might push more unionization, because of the way that the game is rigged now in terms of the legislation and how, as what you've just described, the sort of 5 points as to how unions are doomed, because of those pieces. Even with all of this motion and stuff going on right now, it's kind of doomed in your perspective unless the congressional legislation was changed.
Yes, obviously laws are upheld through a backdrop of culture and things like that have taken place since then. But and Americans, the young people especially don't even know what a union is, most of them.
Right.
But the structural reforms that took place are by far the biggest category of why the unions cannot make a comeback under the current system. It's not the support and it's not the exposure, even if you deal with those things. And it's the same thing for elections too. Why third parties can't do anything in America? It's all because of the way the electoral system is set up, so the two people win.
Right. Interesting.
So what they basically did is they weaponized game theory.
Yep.
That's what that is.
Exactly
everything I just said are things that come from game theory, which is how do you get somebody to make a choice in the way you want them to make that choice.
Yeah.
And to
Pragmatism
guide
goes in that
statistics
direction.
into your favor.
Yeah. So now, even though you support unions, you're still going to act in a way that's against the union because it's the rational thing for you to do.
And
The
of
only
course,
person who wouldn't act that way is somebody who's a genuine altruist who
right,
does it for solidarity or some other
higher
concept.
reason. Yeah.
That's not what the unions are supposed to be. They were supposed to be in your immediate material interest.
Yeah. I think that the piece that we've missed here is the emergence of the gig worker, but also specifically this idea of being your own boss. The self-employed man. Sort of not being if the job is sold as if you were a businessman. You are a sole trader, an entrepreneur. You're in charge of your own fate.
Oh yeah, you are a business partner. A friend of
So
ours.
things like Uber would be an example of this.
Airbnb, especially.
Airbnb as well. I mean, that's also they have to have property for that. But still, individual jobs, so delivery jobs specifically, where it's portrayed as if you are the boss of your own little company, basically. But in reality, you aren't. You are a worker for that company.
Essentially, it's a consistent strategy of capitalism of divide and conquer. The first, though it was carried out very early in the European history, the first, like a written down, formalized version of it is the British splendid isolation diplomacy strategy, right? Against continental Europe. Okay, if any one nation makes it too big, is too powerful, we support everyone else to destroy them. That's so that Europe forever remains fragmented. And of course, when we mentioned that, I talked about exactly how this relates to the unions and how bosses capitalist tactics against the workers, right? So the only way, so think about statistics for a moment. It's about if you had a large sample size of a whole bunch of independently acting kind of entities, right? That on average a bell curve, like where do they go? What ends up happening? So then, in order for game theory, which is based on one, statistics, and two, it is about what's seen as rational is basically absolute self-interest in the short term, right? So the maximum amount of profit in money in the in a short-term kind of perspective. Game theory only works on people if you have that, as in if they are completely atomized, detached from one another, so they do not form one cohesive entity, which is literally what a union is supposed to be. And then two, and that that part also comes culturally. I mean, surely we all understand American culture in the 21st century has literally become that kind of indoctrination, in general. And second would, of course, be all the material factors of reward and punishment, right? Famously, in psychology, it's called behavioralism, where you treat the person as an animal, carrot and the stick, and then you make them go do a certain thing that you want, right? So all of these things are essentially we see, and of course, you take away people's ability to conceptualize the greater world and higher concepts by everything that Vasil was talking about with the control over information and all that. So once you take the person's ability to decipher information and get access to quality information away, and then you atomize them through a culture of encouraging that kind of stuff, and then you proceed to add all those game theory mechanisms in place. Well, you have the perfect formula to do exactly what we were talking about and what we Marxists are so dissatisfied with.
So I think the Vassal, go ahead. Yeah.
They're one and the same. They're no contributory factors. It's all part of it. So the way you manipulate a game in game theory is information changes, choices change, and who the actors are. So the actors are no longer a collective of workers. It's your choice specifically to be in the union. And the other way to do it is by the punishments and the rewards. The rewards have gotten smaller for unions, smaller and smaller and smaller. Another thing about it is this: The unions are there to redistribute profit, not surplus value. And this has been their theoretical flaw since they were founded, right? Because profit itself is only a small part of surplus value that's extracted from workers.
Mhm.
And the profit itself can shrink while other payments of the surplus value increase. So what the capitalists have done is part of the reason why we have this sort of transnational banking, financial sector oriented economy is because, well, the workers can't negotiate for those things. So, and you can't negotiate for their payments that they make to institutions. So they've spent so much money on institutions, so much money on rent, so much money on properties, and buying up those things. The unions themselves, even if you have a union, cannot negotiate with those because those are expensive, those are costs. You can negotiate with what the profit is and how much of that goes to the workers, which is by far a smaller and smaller part of the whole surplus value that's extracted from them. So in that respect, the unions kind of weren't the organizations that should have been, there was going to be a threat to capitalism in the first place. It was that specific thing, their weakness of what they were targeting, that made it so easy for capitalists in the first place to pass all these structural reforms and take away their rights to do so.
So if we consider then that, let's just take it that the unionization motion won't happen, the movement won't happen, there won't be a breakthrough in US politics, and there won't be mass unionization. Let's say that as a given. And if we look at sort of 2 years, let's say 2 years ahead, let's assume COVID stays as it is, but economically speaking, with deindustrialization and already the heightened political situation in the US, where is this all going? If workers don't have the outlets to unionize and win bigger concessions and win a better life for themselves, and they will then, by extension, either stay at the same or, sink lower in their lives, where is this all going for American politics? Where is the outlet going to be? Will we see another or a bigger January 6th kind of thing, and an outburst of some sort of anti-immigrant kind of thing? Where does this all go then? If workers can't have unions to win concessions, or can't have a party that will win them real concessions, where is this all going?
It's going toward tyranny. And republics have the propensity to disintegrate into tyrannical regimes. Right?
This is where your Plato is going to be very good for us. So go ahead. Sorry.
It's true. He says in a cyclical fashion, oligarchies tend toward democracy, and then you have them tend toward tyranny afterwards. Because you have powers in the hands of the many, but the many are under scrupulous effort to be manipulated and become senseless in these assemblies, because they're not listening to people who know those arts. They're listening to people who are good in speeches, who can say the pleasurable things as nice to them as possible. And they cannot handle the fact that their democratic values conflict with their social strata that they have set up. Socrates talking about slaves and says those Athenians, they cannot handle it. They're so sensitive about that. And over time, you get more people becoming richer and richer. They pass down their wealth to their sons. Their sons have no reason to learn virtue or become virtuous people or concern themselves with justice, because they already have whatever they want. And it just descends towards senselessness. That's Plato's view. Now, back to what we're having here in America, our senselessness is in the idea that there is no such thing as correct words. First of all, that's part of their philosophy. There's no such thing as what actual words mean. So we have to deal with everything by making the right choices as individuals and dealing with those consequences as individuals. That kind of society is built on a faulty foundation in the first place. And then you add to that these strict structural regimes that I said that prevent any third-party voice, that prevent any the unions from getting representation of workers in the existing capitalist enterprises. And they prevent workers from doing anything themselves too. I didn't talk about how restrictive they are toward cooperatives, but in America, what is it, like 500 co-ops?
Yeah, it's probably less, but yeah.
It's pathetic. And because they have all this, every state has a different law, the municipal has a different law. Now the federal government has different laws. Nobody understands what these laws even are. You need a PhD in political science to even opine on them. For the regular people, they don't. It's almost impossible to start a cooperative in these conditions.
Mm-hmm.
It's impossible to unionize, or at least it's irrational. You're going to go through hell as an individual to get those benefits from the union, and it's impossible for a third party thing to break through. You're heading toward collapse this way.
Yes.
I have no way to sugarcoat it to people.
Yeah. I'd like to just add on to that two things. One is a material observation. So, as a military enthusiast slash amateur scholar, I guess you can say, I enjoy listening to military podcasting in two languages that I can understand from accredited people, and one of them includes is the Modern War Institute series of podcasts ran by no other than the West Point War College. Recently, there has been a very disturbing trend of 3 episodes in a row by various people on the various sides of the NATO military complex coming out basically saying that policy has failed the U.S. The NATO U.S. military machine. The currently existing system is unable to support them in a fight against China and Russia.
Mhm.
Literally, that's their original words. I'm paraphrasing here. And third is that they essentially see that the military, they like to fetishize themselves as being efficient, right? So like they say, like, we are the only pocket of efficiency in an ocean of chaos and despair. Something to that effect. And they are basically saying now that like the way that's set up in the establishment side of things is that if you're academia, if you're a scholar, you cannot comment on policy. As a professional soldier, you cannot comment on policy. But they get this idea that as a warrior and a scholar, warrior-scholar together, they are, they feel like they should be able to comment on policy.
Mm.
That is literally what we call Imperial Japan militarism.
Right.
It's literally what happened in Japanese history. So, like, when Vasile, I don't know, like, if you are familiar with that side of, research of military shenanigans, but, like, the fact that you arrived to exactly the same conclusion as, like, they are proposing is very telling for every single one of our audience members. It's not something, like, at this point, because, like, Vasil and us, we did not converse before this about these points. Like, we did not know that we had the same viewpoints and observations and predictions. So, like, this is now more than just, like, it's just your opinion, bro. This is now more than that.
Right.
This is something way closer to being objective. And I just want to comment that one of our good comrades at the MTT, who is a graduate student in Canada studying classical philosophy, basically is working on for us this idea of how the Roman concept of res publica, where the public politics governance should be handled in public, right? And how that is a very socialist concept and so on and so forth. So like we see clearly in the Greco-Roman tradition then, that from Plato up to the Roman times, that there is beginning to be this kind of socialistic understanding that you cannot just be private individuals making your own choices, because that's by definition antithetical to what society and civilization is. Because in a most simple mental image, it just turns into a Mexican standoff. That's what capitalist game theory would like us to think, and what it indeed says about the world. So for us to in every single aspect, really, we're just returning to that level of anarchy. I mean, so it's gonna be the like what Lenin says, anarchy of production, but like just anarchy in general.
I see.
So yeah, that's where we're heading, I think.
Final thoughts there, Vassal?
Jen, I would not phrase it that what they're doing is unnatural, because it seems like that's where you were headed.
No.
I believe it's
I don't
perfectly
think it's
natural for
unnatural. I do not.
Yeah, it
it's
is
perfectly
natural.
natural given the history of the United States. In fact, any country where people sort of live more independently, as they have in America, is going to
Yeah.
tend more toward individualist notions.
Yeah.
I mean, think about that from the perspective of the person in the house.
For sure.
I make a mess. I clean everything up.
Yeah.
I take care of myself. That's my life.
Right.
That's how it was for Americans for many centuries, due to their large base and the fact that they were extending west.
Oh, and the American dream, my land, my house, my gun. I think it's something along those lines.
But that's not the way it was in other countries where they've already become more packed and they were more communal. You live with roommates, you understand that, okay, we can't just all clean each other's mess, because the carpet gets dirty by virtue of all of us doing it. Right?
Yeah.
So everything that's a mess that's outside of your room, your little specific personal space, the small chunk of the apartment, everything else is a collective problem. And so you see, even in America, the culture is changing, and it's changing specifically because of the reason I just said, because people's daily experiences at home are changing, because they can't afford rent, they have to live together with other people, and families have to stick together now to pool money, even if they don't like it. That itself is going to change American culture going forward. Also, your little rascals there on the chat saying that I said Trump is a great speaker. What I said is the senseless masses first look toward great speakers, and then later on, as you get more different generations of people, there's no reason to pass down virtue or justice, and then it turns into all just senselessness, and anything can mean anything, and the speeches don't even mean anything anymore. The process of how things go from one to the other is Plato's view.
Fair enough. Yeah. Okay. So I think, I mean, it's been. I didn't expect us to be ending on references to Greek and Roman civilization and the collapse and the inevitable doom and cycles
of the West. What did you expect? Have you seen Washington D.C.? Are you kidding me? Okay.
Sure. No. It makes sense. It makes sense.
Well, the good news is we're not witnessing the collapse of a civilization. We're also witnessing the rise of another one in the East, right?
Right. That's the positive side of this is that we do have something to look forward to. Another future does seem to be taking place ourselves.
I would say that though we understand that we should still, just as Marxists, be on the side of the people on the American continent, to do our best to not just like, here goes, this land is getting nuked, I'm getting out of here. Because like the kind of pessimistic anti-socialist tendency I've seen is like, Twitter group chat, hey, what's y'all's that are full of Marxists, hey, what's y'all's plan if United States collapse? Go to China, drink bubble tea, go to China and play Genshin Impact, go to China. That's disgusting. That's called being a parasite. So that's all I just want to add that.
Well, so let's hope that our comrades in America can organize and maybe prevent, or I don't know, do something about this. But anyway,
don't worry, I'm a true patriot. I'm gonna stick it out to the end.
Great. You said patriot. Now all the rest of the
no!
All the other I'm very happy with this. You've stepped it in there, man. You stepped it in there. No. Let's finish for this week. That's all we are going to discuss. But we will be back next week, and I think we'll definitely have Vassal on at some point again in the future, if you have time, Vassal. It's been a great pleasure to have you, though. Thank you so much for joining us.
I see you.
Thank you very much. Bye, guys.